Hey guys, today we're going to be looking at the 5 main skill areas that you have to focus on if you really want to start climbing the ladder and actually getting better. This is the stuff that I've always personally used, and I'm going to be using it as I try to start to climb up and get better at League again. The 5 areas we're going to look at are your gold and what you do with it, how effective you are at making plays, your laning, team fighting, and your game-to-game consistency or kind of tilt level, I guess. Now, most of this stuff is really hard to track, I think, but this is partly why I waited on the video and why I've teamed up with Mobalytics in the first place, because I can make these videos better. I mentioned them before, but I'm now able to get you all into the closed beta as long as you use my beta key in the description. You can check your GPI, which is going to rate most of these areas I'm going to talk about for you personally, and also the post-game tab. After every game, you're going to be able to see how well you did at certain aspects of the game and check them against your last 5 or 20 games to see if you're actually improving or not. Basically, you kind of get a personal grade of everything I'm going to talk about in this video and see where you're at. That's kind of why I waited to make it. Now, with gold and what you do with it, this section is all about how well you can earn that gold during the game, but also how you're actually going to use that to win as well. Gold is great. Your farming can be perfect, but if you don't use it properly, you're not going to win. So the first half of this is earning it. Farming skills, number one, the most obvious way of getting gold, right? In the early game, mid game, and late game, you're still going to be getting most of your gold from farming. Early game farming is really just practice. Mid game is a lot of wave control as well, plus the attitude of everything here belongs to me. If everyone has that attitude on a team, you'll all be fighting for CS and you'll get it evenly, kind of. It doesn't mean be a dick and steal everything, but at least you're going to have a steady stream of gold. Late game, it mostly comes down to de-pushing waves, so you should kind of have your full build by then anyway. Wave control is a really big topic, I guess, but all you need to really do is think ahead. Like, this is another way of generating gold. To do this properly, you're going to need to think where a wave is going to be in a minute's time or sooner, I guess. Like, if you push bot lane, then you group up, eventually that wave is going to be pushed back, and you want to be there to collect it. Wave control can help you grow leads early and stuff, but in terms of gold generation, it's really about making sure you don't lose it to towers when it bounces back. Kills and assists are obviously another way to get gold, and this comes down to how active you are on the map and with your team. The more you roam around, the more you group in between CSing, the more gold you're actually going to be gaining. AFK farming is not really always the best, basically. So overall then, we have gold per minute, which is a way to track this. Something that your post-game screen will show you if you check that or work it out in client. Seeing how much gold on average you earn per minute of a game is a great way to track this stuff game after game and see if you're improving. Now, if we look at using it, the first thing is your damage output. Obviously, it only applies to carry champions, but if you've taken 30% of your team's gold but only have 15 or 20% of your team's damage, then something is wrong. The better side of this, though, that when you know you're playing really well, is if you've only had 20 to 25% of the gold share but 30% of your team's damage, you know you're using that gold really well. Kill participation is a way for every role to check their impact, though. If you've got loads of gold but you're only a part of 20% of the kills, then you know you really aren't using it. If you're a part of 60% or more, even better. I think that's kind of a good game, I guess. The higher the better, obviously, right? That means you've used your gold to help win. Finally, then, it also tells you how well you can snowball if you get that lead and you keep growing it afterwards. That's kind of hard to measure, but on the flip side, how often you throw a lead is a bit easier. If you're throwing games a lot, you're losing when you're ahead and stuff, you're not using your gold that well. If on the other side, you're not throwing too many games and when you get ahead, you kind of stay ahead, then your gold is normally well used, if that makes sense. Now, this next section is all about what you do in the game. Passively sitting there means that if your team does well, then you probably win, which is great. But if they don't, then you're probably going to lose. Either way, you're relying way too much on them for whether you're going to climb or not. We need to take the game into our own hands, basically. The most obvious way to make a play is to roam from your lane and do something elsewhere, right? Obviously, it's a bit harder for an AD carry. It's going to be easier for a mid or a jungler, but you get the idea. Be less predictable, be where you shouldn't be sometimes, and it'll actually pay off massively. The easiest way to track, though, how you are doing with this, with making plays, is again your kill participation and your assist counts. It's not going to be 100% for making plays and stuff. You could just be there when the enemy team makes the play, but at least you're going to be in the right place and part of the fight, so it's a good start. In my opinion, though, the team that engages often wins most of the time. If they choose to fight, there should be an advantage for them, and they can normally focus the person they've caught kind of quickly and get them out of the fight straight away. Whether you do this as a team or as an individual, it doesn't really matter, but either way, you want to be the one making the plays, at least when you're ahead. Objective control is not really something that most people talk about, but this is for two things. Number one, obviously, objectives are a really good way to win the game. They give you big advantages, whether it's a dragon or a baron. Number two is less obvious, though. Most team fights really should start around objectives. If you can control them, you can force fights. You don't always have to do the objective to get what you want, but mid-game is a really good focus point. Finally, then, for making plays is a different way of looking at this. It's being able to come back in a game. It's a really important skill to have when we're talking about making the right sort of play. Sometimes the right play is actually sitting back and letting them come to you when you're behind. Sometimes you have to just grab them by the balls and give them a good slap even when you're behind. Like, if you can come back in games when you're behind, then your ability to make the right play is actually much better than you probably give yourself credit for. So the third section is laning. Funnily enough, all about your early impacts and kind of like what you're doing at the start of a game and how much impact you're going to have. First of all, a good laner will not just survive, but gain a lead over their opponent. This comes down to two things, really: your ability to zone and ability to pressure. When you pressure somebody in the lane phase, you make them miss CS, you force them to fight, you force them to actually do something, and if you do it better, you're going to get a lead. Even in the jungle, you can look at this as you'll be farming better or you'll be ganking better. When you zone somebody though, you're going to be growing that lead even bigger. You get CS and advantages and gold and stuff, but they're not anymore. You come out of the lane phase with more items, and so you should have more impact. Trading is another core part of this, and I've talked about it in basically every single video I've ever made on laning, but like you actually have to fight if you want a decent lead. Either you can abuse them when their abilities are on cooldown, or you slap them when they are trying to CS. Those are going to be the two key ways. So those are the two aggressive sides, I guess, but you aren't always going to be winning your lane. You're not always going to be ahead. You've got to make sure that you don't get boned super hard and you aren't losing your tower. Even when you're behind, you've got to be able to farm and de-push the lane a little bit so it doesn't crash into your tower every single time. It's a lot harder for like an AD carry rather than a mid laner to do it, but that's a skill that you have to learn. Finally, in this section, if you're anything like me, you're going to play quite aggressively, try and fight, get ganked a lot, and probably die a lot. This is one of my biggest weaknesses as an AD carry, honestly, and that's basically giving them a lead and putting yourself behind. You've got to learn to play around ganks, like they could happen, and always have an escape plan at least when you go forward. It's kind of that thing, you've got to know if they do come down, you can get out some way or you can turn it around or whatever. You don't just want to go randomly diving in hoping it'll be okay, because sure, some games it will be, but sometimes you're going to get screwed. Now I'm going to keep this next team fighting section pretty short because in my opinion it comes down to three really big things. Step number one, obviously, to team fight you actually have to be grouped up with your team, right? Captain Obvious. You can blame them for getting caught all you want, but if you want to win, that excuse isn't really going to cut it. You've got a group. You can look at your kill participation, your battle participation, which is a thing on Mobalytics, your assists and your kill totals over games, and you'll know whether you're in the right place or not most of the time. That's the first thing, but the next one is doing your job properly in a fight. Like, this is quite hard to cover in a general video because it changes so much. Everyone has a specific job to do, and that changes depending on your role, your champion in the game. For damage dealers like AD carries, top laners sometimes, and mid laners, damage per minute and damage share stats are really good ways to see if you're doing your job properly. For tanks and supports, like kill participation, damage taken, shielding, healing are great ways, but it's a little bit harder to track purely with stats. Basically, you have to imagine how the fight will play out before it happens. That's the key to like knowing your job. The easiest way of doing this is imagine how they are going to win the fight and then how to stop that from happening. For example, it could be like their Zed needs to kill our Caitlyn for them to win the fight, so I just have to stop that from happening and we'll be good. The word positioning gets thrown around all the time in loads of videos, but for me, this is what lets us do our job in fights. That is why it is so important. If you're an AD carry, you have to position to deal damage and stay safe, which can be pretty hard. That's why it's quite important. If you're an assassin though, it's just as important. You have to position to get yourself to your target, maybe flank and stuff. You have to position well to do your job. It's the same thing as a support. If you're at the front, then your AD is going to be alone. And if your job in that game is to keep them alive, then your positioning there stops that and you could lose the fight for the team. The final section then is about consistency, which is really for me number one when you want to climb. It could also be attitude stuff, I guess, but this is really important. The first thing is, how is your laning going to go game to game? Can you consistently get a CS lead, a kill lead, and their tower? And if you can, then that means your lane phase is pretty solid. Are you consistently outperforming your lane opponent? Like, are you having more impact in the game and stuff? Those are the keys to laning in each game, in my opinion, like game to game at least. Those things don't really change game to game. Like, you can track them. If you're doing that, then you should really be climbing. The second thing is your tilt in games. So if you're tilting in games when things go bad, if you get frustrated and you do tilt, that's going to affect your consistency a lot. It's hard to switch off sometimes, I know, but getting frustrated means you're going to play worse, really. Even when people say they don't play worse when they get frustrated, I honestly don't believe you. It also means you're probably going to say something passive aggressive, which just pisses off your team even more, and they're either going to int, they're going to feed, or they're just going to play worse. If you want to climb, you really should not play when you're tilted, and you have to try and stay calm in games. If you can do that, then your consistency is going to be much better. There are also two things that majorly impact your ability to climb that people don't really talk about very often. It's how often you throw versus how often you come back in a game. Obviously, if you can come back in games but not throw too often, then in theory you should climb a lot faster because you're winning lost games and you're not losing won games. It's just something to track here. If you feel like you aren't climbing, then maybe you should look at these two things. Like, maybe you're throwing too often, but maybe you're also giving up too easily in games when you're behind. Finally then, a very simple way to track game to game performance and see how you're actually doing is to check your kill participation, your creep score, your gold per minute, your damage per minute, and your deaths. Your kill participation and deaths are a very basic indication of how good your game was. Like, if you have high kill participation but lost, then at least you tried to help your team doing something, and that's good. Your gold per minute, your damage per minute, and your creep score will let you know how you performed over the game. And these are things that really let you know whether you had a good game or not. Things that you can track game to game and see like, okay, in this game I had really high scores, but in this one I had really low. So I probably deserve to lose. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. With the GPI and post-game stuff, I honestly think this should be even more useful because you can see exactly where you are right now for you. But yeah, thank you for watching. Make sure you give a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. But for now, I'll leave you with the robots.